Hey Spookies, before we start tonight's show, I just want to say thank you all so much for your help paying for Chicano's chemotherapy. Chicano is my dog, he's a sweetheart. He's went through 8 chemotherapy treatments and remission appears to be right around the corner. It was very expensive, almost $10,000, but we've raised half of that money on GoFundMe, so if you want to help, any amount is massively appreciated. Just go to weeklyspooky.com and click on Help My Dog. It really means the world to me. But now, my friends, it's time for something a little bit more scary. No one lives here. Think about that sentence when you walk into a house or look at a building that's overgrown and unkempt. No one lives here. The English language can be funny sometimes, but other times it can be downright terrifying.
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my spookies. It's Wednesday, and you know what that means. It's time for a little spooky in your weekly. I'm your host and narrator, Enrique Couto, and we have quite a story for you tonight. It's from Bruce Haney, who's a fan of the show, but also a pretty talented writer. He sent in a short story, and I think you're going to enjoy it as much as I did. And remember, if you have a story you want us to consider, just send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And also, if you want to help the program without having to spend a single penny, all you have to do is make sure you're subscribed on your favorite podcasting app, and while you're at it, leave us a 5-star rating, especially on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It makes a huge difference in bringing in brand new listeners. And if you know anybody who loves the macabre, tell them about the show. These are ways you can help. They don't cost you anything but a moment of your time, and I am forever indebted to you. If you want to go just one step further, you can go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, get bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and so many more exclusives. And you'll know you're directly keeping the show going and going and going. And before we get to the story, I just want to mention that if you head over to Tubi TV, that's Tubi TV, you can watch my new television series completely for free. It's called Found Footage, the series. It's a found footage horror television series produced by myself and Dan Wilder, with many Weekly Spooky alumni involved. And the reason I bring that up, not only because I want you to watch it, but also I bring it up because this week's story is all about trying to capture scary things on camera and how that can go wrong. And we'll get to it right after these quick words. The House That Killed Me by Bruce Haney. There are many different paths to fame that one can follow. You can get the attention you crave from writing, acting, directing, or posting to social media. There are some people who are famous just for posting photos of their lives online or making the exact same 10-second video on TikTok that everyone else already has. Brandon's attempt for fame took the video path. His channel was titled Abandoned with Brandon. Before his final video, he had built his channel up to 1,000 followers. After the final video was uploaded, his subscribership jumped up to 100,000, though everyone knew that he would never post another video. That final clip received 15 million views. Previously, his highest viewed video had 20,000 and was titled Overnight at the Witch's House. You see, Brandon's online niche was that he made abandoned places videos. The Witch's House was a surprise hit for Brandon, though 20,000 was nobody's idea of a hit anymore, but Brandon was proud of it. He had been making videos for just over a year, and this was his first taste of success. He was late to the game, he knew, but he just turned 20 years old and finally was free enough from his parents' hold to start traveling and doing with his life whatever he wanted. For him, that meant making the types of videos that he loved watching. He had been watching urban exploration videos since he was a kid. He still loved them, but he didn't realize that so many of the cool abandoned places had already been explored and exploited for online hits and likes. But the Witch's House did well. He just posted it a month ago, and he was getting new subscribers daily. 3 things led to the success of that video. The first was that this was a new abandoned place that nobody had seen. The second were the symbols he found inside. The third part of that success was the thumbnail he chose for the video. He took a photo from the kitchen into the bedroom where you could see the details of a face that looked like a witch. Web sleuths in the comments were able to figure out right away that it was not in fact a witch face, but a novelty item known as a laughing head that was sold in souvenir shops in the 1970s. The laughing heads were a gag item. They had a little reservoir in them that you filled with water, and if someone pulled the pull me string, it would spit water at them, and then a voice of someone laughing would play while the tongue moved in and out and the eyes opened and closed. Okay, it wasn't a real face, but those laughing heads were nightmare fuel with their black eyes, creepy laugh, and wrinkled skin. Now, with the little success his video got, the place had been discovered, and Brandon's favorite creator, The Forgotten Past, made a video there that got 500,000 views. If this was a few years ago, that number wouldn't be that notable. But abandoned videos are now passé, and having over 100,000 views for that type of video was great. The success of the Witch's House video led to his final production. A viewer with the online handle Lost and Alone sent him a message stating that he knew of a practically untouched abandoned house in eastern Oregon that hadn't been vandalized, had not been filmed, and, best of all, the owners abandoned the house, leaving everything behind. That's what got views. Nobody wants to see an abandoned house for the rot alone. They want to see how people used to live, or find glimpses of creepy things, like old rotten dolls or hidden rooms. Brandon corresponded back and forth with Lost and Alone, gathering info. He wanted to know how rotten the house was. He had never explored a house in Oregon because he heard that, because of all the rainfall, abandoned houses fell apart before they were old enough to be worth exploring. That's the Pacific Northwest for you. Brandon didn't know that eastern Oregon is mostly desert and got much less rain than the area surrounded by Portland did. Lost and Alone confirmed that it wasn't rotten and told Brandon where he could meet him so that they could drive out there together. Brandon didn't like this idea, but he desperately wanted to build on the success of the witch house. Who knows, maybe they'll find creepy books and symbols on the walls there. It annoyed Brandon that people in the comments on his videos theorized that he drew the symbols himself. He didn't. He held the abandoned code of ethics sacred. Document, not destroy or alter. He considered himself an explorer, not a criminal. They met at a gas station 20 miles from the house. Lost and Alone turned out to be a 22-year-old guy named Dan, who just started his own channel and thought he could benefit from making his first video with somebody who had already been doing it for a while. Before they left the gas station, Brandon informed Dan that he would follow him in his own car. Dan was okay with this, saying, "I just didn't want to give you the directions and then you make the video without me." "I get that. It's cool. I'm excited to see the place," Brandon responded. Oh, you're going to love it. The house has been abandoned since the 60s, I believe. My father said it was abandoned when he was a little kid and that none of them dared go near it because it was supposedly haunted. You know, because of the murders and deaths, Dan explained. This made Brandon nervous as this was the first time this fact had ever been mentioned. He questioned Dan about it. Murders? Plural? Dan sighed and said, "Yeah, 5 people have died in the house." Wow, did they catch the killer? Dan sighed again and told him, "Yes and no. The first 2 people who died were killed by their mother after their father left. She resisted arrest when the police came and was shot and killed. The house hasn't had anyone live in it since." Brandon thought to himself, what about the other 2 deaths? The drive to the destination was rough, but the air conditioning in his car made it bearable. The heat was the only part of the exploration that he wasn't looking forward to. His dashboard informed him that the outside temperature was 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The drive was 10 miles of asphalt, and then another 10 miles of gravel and dirt roads, some with pretty deep ruts. They saw only a handful of houses that looked abandoned as well, except for the late-model vehicles parked in the driveways. Brandon wondered to himself why someone would live out this far. The only other signs of life along the route were some grazing cows, some birds, and he thought that he may have seen a coyote. Being that this was the eastern part of Oregon and much of the land was empty, he found himself thinking about the old stagecoaches and schooners that probably traveled this way on their journey west to the more populated areas during the Oregon Trail days. Brandon then thought to himself, I wonder how many people died of dysentery around here. Brandon's trip odometer, which he had reset at the gas station, showed that they had driven 18 miles. He was getting excited that they were almost there. That was when Dan stopped his truck in the road and jumped out, and started walking towards Brandon. "Come check out the road. I don't know if your little car is going to make it past these ruts," Dan said. Brandon got out of his vehicle and cursed himself for not paying more to rent a pickup truck, or at least an SUV. What's another $50 on the credit card? Brandon walked up and looked at the rut, which was about 8 inches deep, and told Dan, "I think I can make that as long as I hit the rut at the right angle." With that, they both got in their respective vehicles. Dan drove right through the rut, but Brandon's rental car got stuck. After a bit of discussion, Brandon decided to jump in Dan's truck and continue. The car would be a problem for later. They could pull it out in the dark, but they couldn't film in the dark, so documenting the house was deemed more pressing. "We just have to watch out for the coyotes when we're pulling that car out," Dan told Brandon. "I always heard that coyotes don't really attack humans," Brandon replied. "Typically no, but my buddy got chased by one around these parts, and I've never quite trusted them ever since," Dan replied. Brandon was frustrated with himself for not being prepared and for taking an unnecessary risk in trying to drive through that rut. Those emotions drifted away when they got to the house. It was beautiful. It was a 2-story home in the Gothic style with a rusty wrought iron fence around it. The paint had long been beaten away from the wind and the sand, leaving a ghost of itself behind. Most of the windows were unbroken, and, since they are in the desert, no ivy or trees blocked the view of the architecture. It had the classic arched roof, with the decorative trim that was mostly intact. Brandon thought this was a real lost gem, and knew that it would make for a great video. Regardless of what they find inside, the thumbnail of the house alone would get him a ton of clicks, possibly more than the Witch House video. "This house has really been abandoned since the 60s and not vandalized?" Brandon asked. Dan replied, "Like I said, everyone is scared of this house. My friends were afraid because of the 2 kids and mother who died here. Enough time had passed by the time I was a kid that people started to dare each other to go up to the house. But nobody lasts more than a few minutes in there. They would hear a creak or claim to hear a scream, and then they would run back outside." With a bit of backstory, Brandon was ready to film his intro. What's up, fam? This could be the dream spot. If you thought the witch's house was cool, you're going to love this place. Brandon then took his camera and faced it towards the house for a brief second. Check out that Gothic architecture. This place is sick. Hopefully it's as cool on the inside as it is on the outside. Before we go any further, let me give you a little history of this house, located in Eastern Oregon. That's all I'm telling you for a location. I don't want this place found and ruined. Before Brandon continued, he lowered his voice, knowing he should be a little more respectful and less animated when talking about the deaths. This house has been abandoned since the 1960s, after a mother killed her 2 children and then was gunned down by the police. 5 people have died in this very house. Brandon suddenly realized that he didn't have the whole story. Thinking on his feet, he decided to ask Dan about the other 2 on camera. He knew he would show Dan at some point during the video to help him get some views since Dan helped him get to this spot. Brandon walked over to Dan with the camera facing the 2 of them and then started talking to the camera. This is Dan from Lost and Found. Check out his channel. He's brand new. He found this spot, so I'm sure his channel is one you are going to want to follow. Link will be in the description below. So Dan, you said 5 people died in this house. You told me about 3 of them. Can you tell everybody about the other 2 said deaths? Dan looked nervous as he made eye contact with the camera for the first time. Yeah, it's really sad. Sarah and Adam were up here and it was... Dan stammered a bit. He knew these people. It was really sad. Adam was a buddy of mine and Sarah was cool. She was a cool person and their bodies were found right in this house just a few weeks ago. Brandon looked over at Dan, shocked. This changed everything for Brandon. He couldn't film an abandoned video in a house where someone just died. Brandon turned off the camera and looked at Dan. People died in that house a few weeks ago? I can't film in this house. That's fucked up. You should have told me that, Brandon said. Why would that be an issue? I didn't think that would be an issue, Dan replied. Brandon was furious but tried to contain his emotions, since Dan did seem to know the last 2 people who died in the house. The problem is that it makes me look like an insensitive asshole to film where someone just died. Brandon then stormed off, leaned against the truck, and put his head down, grabbing the top of it with his hands. Whenever he was really frustrated and needed to think his way out of a situation, this is what he did. After a moment, Brandon said, "Okay, tell me the story. Maybe I can make this work somehow." After a while, Brandon came up with a plan to lie and say that they heard a rumor that the house was going to be torn down because of the incident and that they have to document before that happens. Brandon didn't feel good about it, but this trip was costing him money and he couldn't walk away with the debt without at least getting a video out of it. Okay, fam, so normally we wouldn't shoot in an abandoned place that had a recent tragedy, but the rumor going around is that this historic house that has never been documented is going to be torn down because of the incident, and I feel like it's my duty to film this place. This house looks amazing and it needs to be documented before it's gone. Brandon and Dan entered through the agape front door with their cameras in hand. Inside, they saw a typical 1960s living room, though it was in a state of disrepair. The glue that held the green-flowered wallpaper to the wall had long ago lost its strength and much of it had peeled and fallen to the floor. Brandon was surprised by how intact the rest of the place was. The couch was still there in reasonable condition, though he could see where an animal had been chewing on it because of the off-white stuffing sticking out of one of the cushions. More impressive was that the television was still there. That was always the first thing broken by teens when they snuck into an abandoned house. The 4 legs holding it up looked worse for wear. They were chewed up. Probably rats, Brandon thought. But then again, he thought, If he even breathed on that television, those legs would give out. So maybe it was something larger. All he knew is that he better get some photos of it now, before it fell. Brandon turned off the recorder on his camera and started taking photos around the room for use online to promote the video. First the television, then a photo of the round analog wall clock with the peeling wallpaper around it. He thought about changing the time to midnight for the photo, but one lie was enough for this video. The next shot he wanted was a low-angle one of the blue couch while its white stuffing poked out. So he bent down and was working on getting just the right angle with his camera when he was startled by the unmistakable sound of footsteps above him. He looked around and realized that Dan was gone. What a relief. It must have been Dan, he thought. Then Brandon went back to framing his shot of the couch. That is when he saw her. Since he was framing an angled shot from below, the first thing he saw was her blue shoes and white socks. Her pale white legs were nearly as white as those socks. As he pointed his camera up, he saw that she had a blue dress that matches her shoes. She looked normal enough until he got to her shoulders, which were covered in blood. Weekly Spooky will be right back after these quick messages. He saw the source of the blood when he looked up at her and revealed the bleeding dent in the side of her head. She stared back at him with her faint blue eyes. At first, he thought that her eyes were completely white, but he could just faintly make out the light blue irises. As he looked into her eyes, she began to open her mouth. Ah! A voice screamed from upstairs before the little girl could speak. Brandon was sure the scream was Dan's. He looked towards the stairs and then heard the girl on the couch say, "Get out." Brandon swung his head back in her direction, but she was gone. Startled, Brandon threw his body away from the couch, landing on his butt, dropping his camera. He quickly pushed himself to a standing position. He was about to run out of the house until he remembered Dan's scream upstairs. Brandon ran up the stairs as fast as he could, forgetting his camera and forgetting to check the stairs for stability. Luckily for him, the stairs were okay. Unlucky for him and Dan, who was running down the stairs. Both were moving so fast that they ran right into each other. Brandon's momentum must have been a little more than Dan's because they were slammed upward on the stairs instead of down, which could have been deadly for both of them. Brandon was the first back up and he helped Dan to his feet. Before Brandon could get his story out, Dan started telling him what had happened. "Holy fucking shit, I saw a ghost!" According to Dan, he decided to go upstairs and film his intro so that when he talked to the camera, it wouldn't ruin Brandon's audio. Once he was upstairs, he found a great spot. It was a room that appeared to be a little boy's. A small twin bed sat up against one wall and, on the floor, he found little army men. Dan picked up a few of them and set them up on the dresser in a battle scene, thinking it would look good for the background for his intro. As he was doing this, he heard the floorboard behind him creak. He turned around expecting to see Brandon, but instead saw a small boy. The child looked normal enough, a bit pale, and his clothes were old-fashioned, brown shorts and a white button-up shirt. Dan asked the boy who he was. The little boy just looked at him and then walked past him. Dan turned to watch the boy, and that is when he saw that the back of the boy's head was bashed in. Dan could see the brain and that the blood from the skull had dripped down and turned the whole back of his shirt crimson. This was when he screamed. The boy then turned around and said nearly the same thing as the girl ghost had said to Brandon. "It's not safe. Get out." That's almost identical to what happened to me. I say we should heed the advice, Brandon said. Brandon and Dan ran out of the house to Dan's truck. Dan started it and turned on the air conditioner. It's a bummer to not get a video out of this, but at least the AC feels great. Let's get out of here, Brandon said. We're safe. We're out of the house. Tell me what happened to you, Dan asked. Brandon told him the story about the girl with the dented head on the couch and how she too told him to get out. Why do you think they want us out of there? Dan asked. I don't know. Maybe they don't like the intrusion. They feel like it's their home. They might not even know they're dead, Brandon replied. Then a moment passed and Brandon continued. This is fucking crazy. Before today, I didn't even believe in ghosts. Now I'm trying to figure out their motivations? Dan looked over at Brandon and said, I wonder if my friends are ghosts too. Did they fail to listen to the warnings? So they paid the price? Fuck, I have to go back in, Brandon said. Why? Dan asks. I left my camera, Brandon replied, sighing in frustration. I'll go with you. You shouldn't be in that house alone, Dan said. Then, after a moment, he continued, even though that didn't protect Adam and Sarah. Dan opened his door and got out. You're not going to turn off the truck? Brandon asked. Dan replied, We'll just be in there a couple of minutes and I want to come back out to a nice, cool truck. Brandon entered the house and walked over to his camera right where he left it. After he picked it up, he looked it over to see if there was any damage. That was when Dan started yelling. Adam! Adam! Sarah! Are you here? Dan yelled while looking around the room. This angered Brandon. Dude, the fuck? You want to alert those creepy kids to our presence again? I have my camera, so let's go. Brandon yelled at him. Maybe Adam and Sarah are ghosts too, Dan replied. Well, I don't want to find out, and if so, I don't want to risk dying here and haunting a house in the middle of fucking nowhere. Suddenly, a fact hit Dan, and he expressed it to Brandon. They were found in the cellar. Dan then ran out of the room looking for access to said cellar. Brandon chased after him into the kitchen. Brandon couldn't help but notice how undisturbed and picturesque the kitchen was. He thought to himself, man, this would have been a cool video. Then he thought that maybe he should be recording this, just in case Dan goes psycho on him. Brandon then hit the red record button. Dan found the cellar. It was just off of the kitchen. He yelled for Adam and Sarah again as he swung the doors open and ran down the stairs. There wasn't much light, except what was streaming in from one of the exterior doors of the cellar. Brandon started to follow Dan down the stairs, but when he was halfway down, he heard two voices say, Don't! Brandon swung back around, camera in hand. His camera captured the two ghosts from earlier, though in his camera they were transparent. They continued to stare and then repeat the phrase from earlier. Get out! Then they added, or you'll be eaten! Brandon wanted to leave, but he needed to grab Dan. Plus, they were right in the way of him exiting out through the kitchen. So he stood stunned, not knowing what to do. But suddenly he heard a low growl, and then another, and then footsteps coming back up the stairs. Brandon looked behind him and could see Dan running up as two coyotes chased after him. Brandon turned back around, ready to run through the ghosts, but they were gone. Brandon and Dan ran up the stairs and back into the kitchen. He grabbed one of the metal-framed green-flowered patterned chairs and shoved it against the door to keep the coyotes from getting back in. Let's get out of here, to the truck, Brandon yelled. Dan didn't need to be told twice. Brandon started running and Dan followed right after, but their escape was stalled when they got to the front doorway and saw another coyote standing in their path. Seeing no other exit, they made the poor choice of running upstairs. As they ran, they heard the coyote following them. Once they got to the top landing, the two young ghosts appeared again, and then, in unison, they said, We tried to warn you. This amplified the fear that Brandon and Dan were feeling to the point that they stopped in their tracks. The only thing that got Brandon moving again was hearing the screams of Dan behind him. Brandon ran, but stopped right before he was out of view of the stairs. He looked behind just in time to see the coyote, with its foaming mouth and sharp teeth, biting and tearing into the flesh of Dan's left leg. Dan screamed in agony as the coyote bit down hard and yanked him from the stairs. Dan's screaming did not stop when the coyote let go of him. His screams didn't stop until the coyote bit and ripped the flesh from his neck. Once Dan was dead, the coyote, with its blood-covered face, looked up the stairs at Brandon. After seeing this, Brandon ran to the first bedroom, the little boy's room. He closed the door behind him. Brandon felt safe momentarily. He at least had a little time to think. The room had a window, so he looked out to see if climbing was an option. It wasn't. There was nothing to hang on to, nothing to climb down, just a direct drop straight down. Brandon could see the truck with its headlights on. He thought about how nice that AC would feel as he drove away to safety. He thought, if I get out, I won't even come back for my rental car. It wasn't long before he heard growling and scratching at the door. Brandon sat on the little boy's bed and faced his camera towards himself. Well, I guess this might be it. I'm uploading this video uncut because it might be the last video I ever make. Sorry for the lack of music and clean cuts. Right now, I'm stuck in a room with no way to exit and a coyote trying to get in and eat me. I didn't know coyotes ever attacked humans. I also didn't know ghosts were real until today. Until this house. Brandon started to cry and then turned off the camera. Brandon fiddled with it to upload directly online, and when he was ready to submit it, he realized that he needed to title the video. First he typed, "The Ghost House," and then erased it. Then he typed, "Coyotes and Ghosts," and then deleted that. Finally he typed, "The House That Killed Me," and hit submit. An error popped up and said, "No internet connection. Video will upload when connected to Wi-Fi or cellular network." Brandon had few options for escape. He couldn't go out the window and he couldn't go out the door. He stomped around frustrated. Then the ghosts showed up again. "Shh, be quiet," they said. Brandon's first thought was, fuck these ghosts. But then he realized they were right. If he stopped making noise, maybe the coyote would leave. This did seem to work after an hour, when he heard the coyote get up and walk away. Before exiting, Brandon looked back out the window. It was now dark. He could see the headlights of the truck were still on, so he made his escape. He opened the door, slowly, and walked down the stairs even slower, making sure not to create any creaks. Just as he got to the bottom of the stairs, he saw Dan's mutilated and half-eaten body. Brandon wanted to scream, but thought to himself, how many coyotes are there? Brandon stepped over the body and made his way to the front door and stepped outside. Behind him, he heard Dan's voice. "Do you hear that?" Dan wanted to reply, "Hear what?" but he didn't want to make a sound. Brandon turned around towards the voice and saw the ghost of Dan, who then said, "I don't hear the truck running anymore." Brandon whipped his head around to look at the truck and was happy for a second because the lights were still on. They were dim, though. At that moment, Brandon realized that the battery would keep the lights on for a while after the motor had ran out of gas. Not knowing what to do, and at least knowing that the truck would be safer, Brandon ran toward it. He was within 10 feet when the already dim lights went out. "Fuck!" Brandon yelled. The coyotes heard that, and within seconds he was pounced on by 3 of them. Brandon and Dan's bodies were found a few days later, when 2 officers were out letting locals know that rabies was running rampant through the local population of coyotes. It seems that the test results came back from Adam and Sarah's dead bodies and confirmed that the bites were from a coyote and that traces of rabies were found. Later, after what remained of Brandon and Dan were taken to the morgue, their cell phones and cameras were taken in as evidence. At some point, a curious person turned on the camera, which connected to the open guest Wi-Fi of the restaurant next door, and the footage went online. Within a day, Abandoned with Brandon was trending, and Brandon had his first million-plus viewed video. Well, my spookies, I think that one definitely scratched the macabre itch that we have at the show, and I want to say thank you again to Bruce Haney for submitting his story. And if you want to submit your own, all you have to do is email us at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. We prefer stories to be between 2,500 and 3,500 words, but send in what you got. And a big thank you to Keith Tomlin for helping edit the story, rounding off those harsh edges so that I can read it in my smooth and sultry voice. And I want to say a huge thank you to everybody on Patreon. We have 95 Patreon backers. Thank you so much. And if you've been considering, jump on board. I want to see 100. I've wanted it for about a year now. Help me out. 100 backers on Patreon. All you have to do is go to weeklyspooky.com and click on Patreon. And speaking of, a huge thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who give just a little bit more to hear their names at the end of the show. And they are Bobbletopia.com, where you can get 10% off with code WeeklySpooky at checkout. Megan Hua, Julia Kirsch, Brent McCullough, Gino Lyons, Steve King, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so very much for the support. And if you want to hear your name at the end of every Weekly Spooky episode, just go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and select any tier at $15 or higher per month. And know that it really does help us bring the spooky on the weekly. And it's not always easy, you know. The listenership ebbs and flows between now and Halloween. And I'm so happy to have you diehards with us, listening to the scary stories and having a great time, just like I am. But now, my friends, it's time for me to get back to work because we have so many more scary things waiting for you. So for myself, for executive producer Rob Fields, our producer Dan Wilder, and our composer Ray Mattis, I will talk at you next time.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.